So, welcome to Dear Earth 2. This is the second in a series of short videos where I'll try and present to you, I think, probably a fairly radical view of how we might address some of the crises that are facing us, particularly, I suppose, overall the climate crisis, the lack of biodiversity or the destruction of biodiversity and the environment more generally. Okay, so last session, or the first session I introduced this notion that in our experience is comprised of two elements. One is whatever we encounter through our senses in the world, and the second element we bring to bear on that is the concept, a concept from our, I use the term repertoire, from our repertoire of concepts. It's the concepts that enable us to make sense of the world. And of course, we need these concepts to survive. We need concepts of all kinds to survive in the world. But the actual repertoire of concepts we have is dependent on our circumstances, on our history, on our cultural history, social history, and so on. So that in other parts of the world, at other times, people had a different repertoire of concepts, and therefore the world really was experienced quite differently by them. So they lived really in a different world. We only have to think of people living in very radically different circumstances in if you like, the term primitive of course is used now. They're not primitive at all, but people living in remote parts of the world, let's put it that way. And also ourselves in our history in the distant past. Of course, we had an entirely different, well, not entirely different, but a very different repertoire of concepts, which meant that we were experiencing the world in a different way. Of course, we tend to think that we're very clever now, and that our current or prevailing repertoire of concepts is really the right one, and that past cultures were primitive or unsophisticated or didn't really have the knowledge we have. Therefore, their experience of the world was very limited. I suppose I would generally make the point that they were different, but I would not accept that they were less sophisticated, less healthy, I suppose, and certainly less connected to the world. Okay, so I'm going to try and demonstrate that with the short little image of a child. This is a child in the woods, in the forest. The child is sitting down, you can see it now, and there are ferns, and the child is, you might say, playing with the ferns. Well, of course, you can look at it that way. You can look at this child and say, here's an unsophisticated child sitting in a set of circumstances, and they're kind of playing with what is around them. One can look at it that way. But of course, one could look at it alternately as a child who has been born into this world, as we all have. And I think, as Paulo Freire would say, our primary orientation in the world is that of enquirer, trying to figure out what the world is, and as time goes on, trying to figure out what our place in the world is. So here you have a child, and I would suggest that this is just as sophisticated an inquiry as any intellectual inquiry or scientific inquiry that's conducted in clinical circumstances or situations. Here is a child building a repertoire of concepts. So in other circumstances, you could see this child filling and emptying a bucket of water, for example. So what's happening there? Is the child just enjoying this experience? Well, of course they do enjoy it, and they're thrilled by this kind of activity. But you could also view it as, here is a child building the repertoire of concepts, the concept of fullness, the concept of emptiness, of an empty bucket, if you like, and a full bucket, and lots of other concepts that the child is building. And of course, the child needs these concepts to survive. So you have the concepts of, what is hot, what is cold. We've all experienced this, where a child is going to touch something hot, and you say hot, 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 and that concept of something being hot, and on the opposite extreme of something being cold, something being deep, something being shallow, something being full, something being empty, something being sharp, something being blunt, soft, hard. There are all kinds of concepts that help, on the one hand, determine the child's experience of the world, but also enable the child to survive in the world, in this particular world that we've created around us. And children in different circumstances would have different repertoire. So the repertoire of concepts on the one hand enables us to survive, manage in the world, but it also limits the possibilities of our experience. That this repertoire of concepts is has a positive, if you like, and a negative side. So the question then arises as to what are the fundamental concepts that we have upon which we've built our culture, upon which we've built this technical or technological culture that we experience, rapidly moving forward in technological advances. What are the fundamental concepts that underpin that? Or rather, I suppose I'm making the point that we need to look and see, we need to accept in the first place that there are fundamental concepts that have determined the trajectory of our culture and our history over these past 300 or 400 years. There are assumptions we've made about the world. So we need to look back and think, what are these assumptions, and do they serve us anymore? Are they serving us? So we need to reach back particularly to a time that's been given the name of the Enlightenment. So we're talking about the 16th, 17th, 18th century, I suppose, 17th and 18th century in the main, and the precursor to that time, what's become known as the scientific revolution. It was Immanuel Kant who gave it the name Enlightenment, because people were becoming, if you like, enlightened. They were freed up from religious dogma. They were freed up from believing that the truth of the world was carried in, revelation, in divine revelation, and so on, and that the truth of the world is something that's amenable and can be discerned by the human being. And the fundamental and central concept that entered or at least prevailed in our culture at that time and continues to prevail in our culture, is the concept that was articulated in different ways by different people. But basically it is that the truth of the world is discernible only through mathematics, only through measurement. And we can understand the attraction of that, emerging as it was from a regime of truth, if you like, which had a religious basis or a faith basis. We're now emerging into a regime of truth which has as its basis mathematics. And you can understand the reassurance that gave people that mathematics was very trustworthy. 1 and 1 will always be 2. So mathematics, and that idea actually, although it was given expression in the Enlightenment, it reaches very far back in our cultural history. It reaches back to the ancient Greeks. It goes back to Pythagoras, and as far as we know, it goes back beyond Pythagoras to the Arab mathematicians. That tradition or that culture. So again, to articulate or at least it was articulated also in another way, that the language of creation is mathematics. That God's language of creation is mathematics, and that the truth of the world is to be discerned only in mathematics. This, of course, this basic assumption, this fundamental assumption, is what gave impetus to the scientific revolution, and through the scientific revolution and elements of the scientific revolution gave rise to profound changes in other spheres. So in the social sphere, around challenging the assumption around poverty and richness, or the aristocracy and the peasant, and brought to the fore this notion that human beings, as human beings, had rights that attached to them as human beings, didn't attach to them because of their social position, but attached to them by virtue of them being human beings. This notion of human rights. The challenge to religious authority is another part of it. There were political change. Fundamental and revolutionary political change based on these notions of individual rights, and ending ultimately in actual revolution. So you had the American Revolution, if you like, you had the French Revolution. It's probably the most, you could say, the most powerful manifestation of this change, where previously deeply held social, religious and political and so on ideas were fundamentally challenged. So we had the Copernican revolution, and we could talk a lot about that, but I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but the Copernican revolution, which really helped unsettle people's certainty about what was revealed to them as truth. So that foundational concept of mathematics had a profound transformative effect. And I'll express the idea in this way, that the truth of the world is to be determined through mathematics, and that the language of creation is mathematics. And this idea, along with another Greek idea, which was the idea of the concept, if you like, of the atom, these two fundamental ideas have gave huge impetus to this change, to this scientific change, and really they stand there as fundamental assumptions in our culture today. However, what's happening now in 2024 and over these next few years is that people are beginning to question the extent to which these fundamental assumptions and the science and the technology derived from these fundamental assumptions, do they serve us? Do they continue to serve us? I mean, they have given us tremendous things. They've given us what we could describe or understand as great advances in medicine, in communications, in personal comfort, in our lives, in transport, in lots of other areas. You could say that technology, I use this phrase, that mindset, that mathematical mindset has given us all these wonderful things. But of course it has also given us weaponry which can, the hugely powerful weaponry, they have contributed to the destruction of the environment and to the loss of many, many species. And we're becoming aware now of the extent to which that particular mindset has polluted our atmosphere, the air, the water, many aspects of our lives, probably in many cases beyond recovery. So that we're beginning to question this authority that was carried in this mindset, in this way of looking at the world. And probably rightly so. Perhaps taking account of all the circumstances that we look at the positive and negative of these, perhaps we might begin to discern that there may be a fundamental flaw, a fundamental and powerful flaw in this way of looking at the world, this lens, this mathematical lens, and that perhaps we need not just to take all the kinds of actions that we hear with electric cars and recycling and all these, they're all wonderful, but the problem is much, much more deep-seated. It's a much more profound issue around these fundamental concepts. We need perhaps to challenge that that it's the heart of our technological world. We need to challenge that, and we need to challenge the authority, the overweening authority of what we could call normal science or science. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for this time. I'm just going to give a hint that I'm going to introduce in Dear Earth 3, I'm going to introduce, if you like, the hero of the story. Because on the one hand, it's valuable, of course, to look back and see how we've come to know the world the way we do. But how do we move on from here? How do we make that, if the assumptions, if the fundamental basic concepts that underpin the culture that is, if you like, destroying the planet, we need to, if they're that deep-seated, then obviously the solution is not going to be as simple or surface, superficial. It can't be addressed superficially. It has to be addressed at that profound level. And as I say in Dear Earth 3 at the next session, I'm going to introduce what I consider the hero, the cultural hero that maybe provide us with one possible way to make the changes that are necessary.